Good evening. Welcome to Thursday Book Club. For anyone new, my name's Suzanne Leal and I'm the author of the novels The Deceptions, The Teacher's Secret and Border Street. As some of you will know and others won't, I started this book club during the 2020 COVID lockdown, and it was a way to connect writers and readers online. 2 years on, we've continued to meet weekly on Zoom with a guest writer coming to visit us once a month. Or in this case, we have 2 guest writers. If you'd like to be part of Thursday Book Club on a more regular basis, please go to my website, which is suzanneleal.com, and sign up to the newsletter, which will give you all information. So what I'm going to do now is, before I introduce you to our guests, I'm going to ask everybody, apart from my guests, to mute, and that way we won't have any interference. But please have your questions ready and put them in the question and answer or the chat section, or the question and answer section, whichever you like, and we'll have time for questions at the end of our interview. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So, but now to our guests. 2 guests, and each of them will, I think, be well known to all of you tonight. The first is Emeritus Professor Ross Fitzgerald, who is an historian, an author and a political activist. And with him is Ian McFadyen, who's an actor, director, writer and producer. Their recent collaboration is this novel, which is The Lowest Depths. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Welcome, pleasure to be here.
Ross, let's start with you. The Lowest Depths is the 8th novel, am I right, in your series about Dr Grafton Everest?
Professor Grafton Everest.
Yes, I was wondering if Professor Dr Grafton Everest, but he's Dr Professor.
It's part of the humour.
Which is, but also a German way of using titles, is it not?
It is indeed.
Mr. Dr Professor.
And this one is largely set in Russia. Under the dictatorial president Vladimir Putin, who gets assassinated in this novel. And I'm hoping that life will soon imitate art.
It's I was not going to give away too many secret parts of the book, but I think we've got it out on the table now that Putin is indeed assassinated in this book. Before we get on to President Putin, for those who are yet to encounter Grafton Everest, Dr. Professor Grafton Everest, could you paint me a picture of him? How would I recognise him?
Well, he's what I could be if I let myself go. He's gluttonous, he's lazy, but yet he always sort of finishes out on top. I don't know whether anybody's old enough to remember the William books, you know, William goes to school, William pulls it off, or whatever they were called. So that's the sort of basis. But the first Grafton Everest novel was called Push from the Wings. And that was at a time when my colleagues were trying to sack me at Griffith University, and Joe Bjelke-Petersen and his Attorney General were going to put me in jail. And I found it very hard to get my books published. And a friend of mine in Alcoholics Anonymous called Broken Hill Jack said, don't you start to feel they're using you, laddie, you start to feel you're using them. And satire was a way of enabling me to come to terms with all of these problems. And I started taking notes. For example, I remember that one of the minutes at Griffith University went unanimous with one exception, believe it or not. I find that funny, but nobody else does, I suppose.
And of course,
and so he's an anti-hero. He wears a Panama hat. He doesn't drink alcohol. He supports the Collingwood Football Club. He's about 17 stone in the old, but he's very fortunate to have found a wife called Janet, who was tremendously supportive of him.
And of course, in The Lowest Depth, Janet's gone on a trip and has left Grafton Everest to fend for himself. How successful is he at daily chores and household?
Absolutely hopeless, like me. My darling wife of 45 years, Lyndall, died in 2020, and she did everything. So I'm stumbling around this big house. All I ever did was to write books and tell funny stories. So that's why we open up with Grafton going to the supermarket for the first time. And he doesn't do very well, but somehow he comes out on top in all of the 8 Grafton Everest novels. The first 2, Push from the Wings and All About Anthrax, are set in a university called the University of Mangoland. And it outlines in a satirical way the problems with current universities that are just getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, if I was at a university these days, they'd cut off my cock and feed it to the ducks. But fortunately, I got out of the university system in time, because it's a shambles and a disgrace. But let's hear from Ian, who's much funnier than me.
Thank you very much, Ross. Yes, let's hear from Ian. And Ian, the question I have for you is that you've written this and other of the Grafton Everest novels in collaboration with Ross. Before we talk about the collaborative process, I want to know how you know each other. How did you two get together as collaborators? Or before?
The funny thing is, we both went to the same school. We both went to the same high school, which was Melbourne High School. But Ross is a lot older than I am. Actually, he's only 3 years older than I am. So, or 3.5 years older. And he was brilliant and kind of matriculated at the age of 16 or whatever. So we didn't know each other. He had left by the time I arrived at Melbourne High School. So I wasn't aware of his existence at all, nor was he probably aware of mine. But he wasn't the target audience for the comedy company, that's for sure. But we met about 2002 when Ross had the idea of doing a film about how the last prime minister of Russia, that is Alexander Kerensky, who was the moderate socialist who was ousted by Lenin, ended up marrying a girl from Brisbane. Who in fact became Madame Kerensky, because Kerensky was always regarded as legitimate prime minister of Russia in exile throughout the reign of Lenin and Stalin. And we had this rather strange situation where she became actually very ill. This woman called Ellen, she called herself Nell. She put her name back to front, Nell Tritton. She became very ill and she actually came home to Brisbane, and Kerensky came with her. He actually nursed her in her dying years in a suburb of Clayfield in Brisbane. It's a little known connection between Russia, not Tsarist Russia, but socialist Russia and Queensland. But at that time, there was some thought we might be able to get funding from Russia, because there was a lot of interest around about 2000 and in the early 2000s about Kerensky, because Russia, of course, had thrown off communism, and we're sort of starting to look back to the, if you like, the fact that they almost became a social democrat country. But unfortunately, it hardened up very quickly after that. We found that, in fact, we've actually gone back to pro-Stalin. We've gone back to pro-Stalinism in Russia, which in a way is a kind of a stimulus for this 8th book. So we met about that project, which never got off the ground. And then Ross made me aware of these books that he had written at Griffith University about an academic at Queensland University. The thing was, Ross had a problem. He'd written, was it the late 80s, Ross, when you wrote the first book?
1986.
86. And he'd written 4 books about an academic at Queensland University, but then he retired. And so he moved to Sydney with Lyndall, and we discussed, well, what could Grafton do now? Because the books are very autobiographical up to a point, the character of Grafton. And without going on too much, I'd been working on a situation comedy for a political sitcom about someone who gets elected to Parliament almost by accident, a young guy who gets elected to the state government virtually by mistake. And he finds he's got the balance of power, because this was the time in the early 2000s when we had the preference whisperer and we had minor parties coming online and getting into the Senate and having, controlling votes in the Senate. So I couldn't sell that sitcom. I wrote quite a few episodes of it, and I had a producer working on it. We couldn't get anyone interested. Even the ABC didn't think that was a funny idea about I was trying to write a kind of a yes minister, basically, the novice learning the political ropes. And then, so I said to Ross, what if Grafton gets elected to the Senate? Again, without his knowledge. He has this, there's this Machiavellian character in the books called Mr. Horton, who is based on a real character who was our science teacher at
my biology teacher.
A guy called Norton Hobson, who was a rather mysterious character, as it turned out. So the Mr. Horton, who is has strange connections to the intelligence community, somehow contrives for Grafton to be elected to the Senate, and it ends up in having the balance of power. So it was a great opportunity for political satire, because he was now a complete novice, a quite naive senator, but he's being wooed by both the Conservative Party and the Alternative Party to vote for their work. So he suddenly has this unforeseen power, and that was pushed from the wings, which I think had some pretty funny stuff in it. And so then it was just a matter of, well, what could happen to him after that? So we then developed it on from there, and he became, in book 7, he became the first president of the new Australian Republic, which is called the Dizzying Heights. And then he became he became a special envoy for the United Nations. He's sent to Russia to investigate electoral fraud and gets caught up in a Cold War type spy thriller.
Thank you very much, Ian. Ross, it's not just that, is it? Grafton Everest has a very personal reason for coming to Russia as well. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, that he's supposed to be writing his memoir, and he can't write a line, but he uncovered a letter that his mother Avis, and Avis was married to Mr. Horton, who was in charge of the newly privatised Australian Security Organisation. And the letter was written to his brother. Now, he never knew he had a brother. And the brother somehow, he found out, lived in Russia. So he accepted, as an ex-president of the Australian Republic, he accepted an invitation to come to Russia to investigate electoral fraud and corruption. But the background to it is he wants to find out about who this mysterious brother is, which I won't reveal because people will read.
No, you've got to buy the book. We're not going to give it all away tonight.
Now, the interesting thing about having a book that hops countries, so here from Australia or Mangoland to Russia, is the question of languages. And it seems to me that despite being a particularly bright person, Dr. Professor Grafton Everest is not a linguist. As novelists, how do you get away from that problem, get around that problem where you have a protagonist coming to a country where they don't speak the language? Ross, any ideas?
Well, when I was drinking and I was bad, mad and dangerous to know, I got sacked from a couple of universities here in Australia when you had to interfere with the Vice-Chancellor's dog to get sacked. They sacked me twice. And I finished up getting a Fulbright scholarship based on my fluency in Russian. I can't say fart in Russian, but I was that insane I thought I could speak Russian. And in the 3 years that I was in America, everyone assumed I was a Russian speaker. I mean, I can say words like Govret Peruski, but when Grafton is in Russia, it is assumed that he can speak Russian, but that he prefers to speak in English. I don't know whether Ian can add to that.
Well, Mr. Horton comes to the rescue as usual and just gives him a little device, one of those little automatic translators, which of course you can't make this stuff up anymore because, of course, you exactly have Google Translate now. On you can have apps where on mobile phones which translate what people say. But we give Grafton a little earpiece that he can understand. It automatically translates any languages, which gives us a little bit of humour in the book when he's in Moscow and he's going to all these lavish dinners that are put on for the United Nations delegates who are treated very richly. As he wanders around the tables of the banquet rooms, because they get a lot laid on for them, these UN delegates, he can hear what all of the other delegates are saying about each other, including him. And they don't know that he understands it. So it's really, that's really Douglas Adams' Babelfish from Hitchhiker's Guide. You know, the all-purpose translator there. But of course, he does have a situation where he loses it. Of course, it'll be at critical moments. Of course, it'll malfunction or he'll lose it. So he's lost. But I think that's part of the fun of that. If you're doing a sort of a mock spy thriller, having all sorts of complications about language, I think is part of the plot.
And a lot of the things that Ian and I or myself have written have come true. In that Push from the Wings, I made Grafton's wife, Janet, get a job in fibre art. And lo and behold, you know, a year after the book came out, there was a university in regional Queensland offering positions in fibre art. And in golf management. And believe it or not, now there is a degree in golf management in Queensland.
Well, one of the most depressing predictions was in Going Out Backwards, when Grafton is unknowingly elected to the Senate and has this enormous power. One of the sinecures he's given is to be in head of a tertiary education reform committee. So he ends up going back to his old university in Queensland, where of course they hated him at the time. Now they're terrified because he can cut their funding, and he makes them explain what they're doing with their curriculum, and he finds to his dismay that just about all the kind of traditional subjects such as history, philosophy, literature, economics, and so on have been relegated to a small department called legacy studies, and the rest of the curriculum is based on very much on marketing, golf management, entertainment management, things like that.
Wellness,
the courses, which are now, of course, I think we noticed the other day, or someone. University in the United States had a core. I think you do a master's degree.
A master's degree for $17,000 a year in happiness.
Yes,
in happiness.
Yeah, a degree. You can do a degree in happiness.
And Grafton eventually became professor of life skills and hospitality,
which they now have.
Which they now have.
So. This is we've been asked many times about the problems of writing satire, and the biggest problem with writing satire, it's very easy to be satirical, but the week after you write it comes true. It's very, very hard to be more absurd than the world rapidly becomes. So whatever the craziest thing, again, in the Going Out Backwards, one of the committees he was put on to was the Tectonic Change Committee, because there was scientific evidence that human activity was speeding up, it was disabling the crust and causing the movement of continents to accelerate. So the continental drift was accelerating, which meant that Australia could be colliding with New Zealand much quicker than it should. With things like jumbo jets landing and kids on poker, all these vibrational things were loosening up the relationship there and causing all these sort of mining activities were causing earthquakes and volcanoes and disabling the crust. Well, a year later, was a great protest in America, in Oklahoma, where they claimed that oil drilling was causing an increase in earthquakes, which is, of course, complete nonsense. But they were seeking compensation from oil companies, saying that oil drilling and fracking had increased the number of earthquakes on the West Coast. So you can't really. It's very hard to be nutty enough to ever exaggerate anything now.
And in the first Grafton, which I wrote myself, Push from the Wings, It set Brisbane floods, and one of Grafton's main enemies gets wiped out with a bazooka. But then it turns out that the Wivenhoe Dam is built over a rather big, what's the word? It's not crust.
Outline, yes.
Yeah.
And of course, Brisbane did flood
Again.
Eventually. So, yes.
But because of the Wivenhoe Dam.
Do you think the thought that satire is difficult because you can't explore something crazy enough to be ahead of reality, is there a different answer to that? For example, like when I was pregnant, I found suddenly that everybody I saw was also pregnant, or if I wanted to be pregnant, everyone was pregnant, or women around me. Is it the same thing that when you're writing satire and you're focusing on a particular issue, your mind becomes more focused, and so you see the crazy because you've thought of it yourself? Ross?
Well, you do. You become alert to it. A friend of mine, Doug McLeod, who's a brilliant writer who wrote things like Kath and Kim, who died recently, once paid me probably the best compliment I ever had. He said, Ian McFadyen taught me that writing comedy requires constant vigilance. And I think that I wasn't aware of that, but I think that's probably true. To be a satirist, you really, I suppose you're looking at everything critically all the time. You probably become quite pedantic about things, but you are constantly, and it can be a little bit depressing. If you go on a hunt for the madness of the world, you find a lot of it. I mean, you can strip mine it, and I must admit, every morning I'll sort of switch on the computer and I'll have a look at some of the websites of the major newspapers around the world, and it's the stuff you hit that comes up. You just go, this is just nonsense. This madness. What I was telling Ross the other day, there was an essay on CNN about racist fonts. It was an article written by someone saying that there is now a lot of historical kind of concern over the way in which people used to do things like Chinese. They'd write Chinese restaurant, but in that kind of calligraphic state, like it was brushstrokes, like it was like Asian-looking lettering, and it was sort of like, once upon a time we thought this was normal. We now know this is incredibly racist. This is very, it's stereotyping Asians or whatever by having something that like calligraphic fonts, kind of ignoring the fact that it was the proprietors of the Asian restaurants who chose the sign or whatever. And it had a wonderful thing where it said, we used to think this was normal, but now thanks to critical race theory, which shows us that there is systemic racism, we now know that this is all racist. We now know that everything is racist, whereas before we didn't realize it was racist, but now thanks to critical race theory, we now know everything is racist. Yeah. It's nuts, and you think, this is just nuts, what a racist font.
And I think the first time that Ian and I had a meal together, he came down to Sydney to help his daughter who was trying to get into NIDA. And we went to a Chinese restaurant in Kensington. We were the only Europeans there. And straight away when the first course was served, the owner came up and said, "So far, so good." And after the second dish was served, he would say, so far, so good," which leaves us with an eerie feeling that something terrible was going to happen. And in fact, there was a book that I did with Anthony Fennell between the Going Out Backwards and the Dizzying Heights, and that was called So Far So Good.
It was slightly disconcerting. I don't know what he thought that saying meant, but it was rather strange for the.
It leaves you with a feeling that something terrible is about to happen.
Maybe the joke was on you.
Yes.
What I'm interested in as well is Ian, the work that you've done has encompassed enormous shows, writing, acting, producing. But I must say, in our household, your claim to fame for the younger members is as Grandpa Bob in Bluey. Tell me how that came about, and how do you feel about your appearance?
I'm sort of surprised, because it was a simple invitation to come in and do a voice track for a character on the show. I might say that I became aware of Bluey very early. There was a seminar on children's television up here in Queensland a few years ago, and I've written a lot of stuff for children. I was in ABC. I was originally trained in television, the ABC Education Department, doing programs for schools, and I wrote for the children's drama. And more recently, back in the 90s and early thousands, I wrote a lot of animation programs, Crack-a-Doo and Wicked, and these adaptations of children's books. So I sort of went along just as a moderator host there. And this guy, young bloke called Joe, came in, and he said he'd made this pilot for kids about a family of dogs. And he showed this pilot, and I hate to use that cliche, blew everyone away. Everyone was just knocked out. It was a terrific show. It was so beautifully written. And it came out of the fact that Joe had been a single dad raising his kids, and he'd learned to find ways to play with his kids, to sort of relate to them in a funny and amusing way, and invent games and things like that. And everyone just said, wow, this is going to work. And it did. It's become one of the best things. And the ABC, of course, is dining out on it now. Everywhere you go, you can go to the shopping centres over the holidays, and they've got a Bluey show on, and they've got people in Bluey costumes. So they're marketing the life out of it at the moment, because it's one of the few things you've got that's working. But it was terrific. But I was just asked to come in and do voices for Grandpa. And it was only one day I went in, I read some stuff and made a lot of doggy noises and things. I didn't even know it was going to be a continuing character, but apparently he's in there somewhere. So, but unless maybe, I don't know. I mean, there may be other people doing Grandpa as well. So if it's been going on for a while. But it is enjoyable doing that stuff.
I haven't done a lot of research on this, but my initial research seems to imply that Grandpa Bob hasn't made a reappearance for a while, and that there are viewers of Bluey who are concerned about that and would like to see him.
Well, I hope they all write to the ABC, because I'll get some more work. I'll get some more voiceover sessions then. That would be good.
I think that's
Ian, Suzanne, Ian knows this story, but a little while ago, I was at a place called Turramurra, and this middle-aged lady came up to me and she said, "Are you Professor Ross Fitzgerald?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "It must be terrible having someone with the same name as you who writes those dreadfully obscene novels." That's true.
No.
Isn't that wonderful? And then she said to me, "And I have to say, you look much better on the television."
Fantastic. They're the people you want.
I think everyone who's in show business gets those kind of encounters all the time. Yeah.
And do you find, either of you, that people feel they know you, so they can be either intimate with you or frankly honest with you, or just shy?
I haven't been, I must say, I haven't been lucky enough to have anyone wanting to be intimate with me. but no, I find people are actually rather apologetic. I don't mind. People will come up to you in the cafe and go, there's two things they'll do. They go, "Are you him?" And I go, "Are you him?" And I go, "Oh God," because sometimes I get it wrong. They'll go, "Are you him?" And I go, "Yes." "Oh my God, Michael Veitch, I love you," and it'll be, "No, it was the other show," But generally speaking, they come, "Oh, so sorry, I hate to bother you. I just want to tell you, we love the show." And I find they're very good. They're very, polite and apologetic there. But then again, our audience, when we did the Comedy Company in the late 80s, I mean, that audience are now people they're all over 40, because it's 33 years ago. So they're nice middle-aged people now with fond memories, which is good. Well, I've got fond memories of the shows I watched on television. I don't think anything today is as good as the shows I used to watch on television when I was a kid. It always has that effect on you. You love the stuff you grow up with.
Ross, from your perspective, I was reading up about your relationship with your late wife, Lyndall Moore. Now, she was really quite something and quite somebody. Can you just explain a bit, Ross, a bit about Lyndall's career and how you...
Yeah, well, the reason we got on so well is I had no idea who she was. And Barry Humphries, who's a mutual friend, said to me, listen, someone's coming to their first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous tonight at St Vincent's Hospital. Would you mind, going there and saying hello to her? I didn't know that she was Australia's most famous model and that she was living with Australia's second richest man. And my first words to her after the AA meeting was, if you only knew what could happen to you if you stayed close to Alcoholics Anonymous. And she would have fallen over backwards at the idea that we'd end up being lovers, let alone being married. And so it's true that the reason we got on so well is I had no idea who she was. And also she said she's never been pursued as much as by anybody. She reckons she never said yes to getting married, but we did.
And how long were you married for?
43 years. We met on Guy Fawkes Day, November the 5th, 1974. We became lovers on Guy Fawkes Day, 1975, and we got married on Guy Fawkes Day, 1976. But her nickname in AA was Adequate from Arncliffe because she used to talk about in her work, striving for adequacy, not for perfection. And that enabled me to start writing because pre-AA, my motto was, if at first you don't succeed, stop. And so listening to Adequate from Arncliffe and also taking heed of James Thurber's motto, don't get it right, get it written, got me starting writing.
Does that strike a chord with you as well, Ian, that do it adequately to get it done, or do you work differently?
I don't know. I do agonize over everything. I mean, I'm talking for my experience is substantially to do with writing scripts, like play scripts, movie, television, and so on like that. I must admit, I always try to make that first draft the final product. Someone sent me people send me a lot of scripts sometimes for assessment to think, to get notes on it, and I'll get a script from someone that says the 11th draft. Like, how the hell do 11th draft? I had to be pushed to do I'm one of those people who writes and go, there it is, let's do it, and they go, it needs more work. And what do you mean more work? What? This is it. Let's go. Let's shoot it. And there's always say, we need, I go, all right. And I go back and I look at it and I go begrudgingly through it. And it is better the second time. I see more, I put more into it. I think, that could be better. That could be shortened. I do improve it. But
and when we work together, we improve it, don't we?
Well, the other thing in my experience is that working in comedy has always been very collaborative. When you're writing a sketch comedy show, something like the Comedy Company began. It was a weekly sort of program where on a Thursday morning you sat around a big table at the studio. Most of the cast and most of the writers, a couple of people weren't allowed to come because they're too disruptive. And I used to have a cassette player, a little cassette recorder. I'd put in a one-way cassette, which is an hour on each side, and press record. And we would talk about the show we'd just done. We'd talk about what's happening with the characters, and then just say, has anyone got ideas? And someone say, we should do something about tax, or we should do something that's happening with petrol prices, or or the Olympics is coming up. And we talk, and I'd turn it over, and it was at the end of 2 hours, that was it. Then I would take that cassette home, put on my earphone, put it in my little foot pedal transcription thing that night, and go through. And there'd be half a dozen sketches pretty much just they would have just improvised them around the table. One of the funny things about comedy writing like that is that sometimes people will just rattle off, they'll bounce off each other, and they'll virtually do the sketch around the table. And the reason I would record it is otherwise you go back later, you go, I must write that up. And then you go, oh, what was it? Glenn just, he phrased that perfectly, and I can't remember how he said it. So that it was using the recording, I could really transcribe like how it was there on that. All I had to do was tidy it up a bit and then give it back to the writers and say, work on this a little bit. So collaboration, yes, comedy is often done in that people, you say something, someone else adds to it, then you add more, and you somehow in 5 minutes you've got a sketch.
But the Grafton Everest adventures are really rather unusual, aren't they? Because there's some key characters that develop chronologically. I mean, the closest, I suppose, is P.G. Woodhouse, Jeeves and Bernie Wooster, but they don't develop, they're fixed. And so Grafton and some of the key characters, like his wife Janet and Mr. Horton and so on, and Nanny Neal, they do develop. Well, it's been fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. These books are actually very much like a sitcom. You know, in television, someone comes up with an idea for a situation comedy. Philip Rosenthal comes up with an idea for Everyone Loves Raymond or Seinfeld or whatever. And I've created a couple of sitcoms, and usually the creator writes the pilot and a few other scripts. They shoot the pilot. The network says, we like the pilot. They will commission 13.5 hours. So then you're under the pump to turn out the script. So the writer may be a bit ahead. They may have 4 or 5. And then there's a time you have to bring in other writers. And I've been on both sides of that. I've written for established shows, and I've also created shows where we did a show for Channel 7 called Newlyweds with Annie Jones, we did about 52 episodes of that. And that was, again, you're shooting an episode a week. So you're under the pump to get a script out every week. And I can probably do a script in 2 weeks, like a couple of drafts, but you need help. So then you bring in other writers. But to help the other writers, you've got to have a thing called the Bible. So you have this big dossier, which has a page on every character, you know, where they came, where they grew up, what the name of their parents, their jobs, even stuff that never appears in the show, just so the different writers don't, you know, call the sister a different name in a different episode. And often you'll have an idea for a story, so you'll bring the writer in and go, okay, we're thinking in this one, whatever it is, in Newlyweds, Annie's sister comes to stay and she's a real nuisance, etc., etc. You plot out a little bit and you send the writer away to do that. And there are 2 advantages to bringing in that other writer. One, of course, is it just takes off the sheer load of just writing, just typing, just actually filling up the pages and getting a structure to the story. And the second thing is that even if you've given them the basic story, they bring new ideas into it. So they bring
our relationship,
which is sorry.
Do you think our relationship in the Grafton?
Well, this is a very similar situation, Ross, because you wrote the first
4.
3. Well, the first 3 by yourself.
Yeah.
You brought in Jordan to help with the 4th, Fool's Paradise. I came in on the 5th.
Anthony
on the 6th, and so on. This is very much like a literary sitcom, and it also has that characteristic that you have a regular set of characters, but as in sitcoms, you do have a longitudinal arc of development of the characters, because, you know, as time goes on, when you notice all those sitcoms like Roseanne or whatever, the children grow up, you know, you start off, they've got kids at primary school, then they're at college or whatever. So you do have those long-term arcs there. So this may well be the only kind of series of books in Australia, I think, that have ever been produced by that collaborative method, a bit like a TV show.
But I'm just mindful of the time, and what I wanted to get to is questions from the audience. If you've got a question, just so we can manage it, please pop it in the chat line. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for any questions to come in the chat, Ross, some book recommendations for members of Thursday Book Club. What have you got for us?
Well, to be narcissistic, but The Dizzying Heights
Yes.
is the one before, and really The Dizzying Heights and The Lowest Depths bookend each other. And given the fact that you've talked about Lyndall, this is my memoir, 50 Years Sober,
Yes.
An Alcoholic's Journey, which is dedicated to darling Lyndall. And the other book is Gerard Henderson's absolutely fascinating biography of Cardinal Pell, called Cardinal Pell, The Media Pile-on and Collective Guilt, published by Connor Court.
Thank you.
Have I done that too quickly?
No, got it. Thank you very much for that. How about you, Ian? What have you got for us in terms?
Well, I've got out because I had done my homework on this, which is not untypical of me. I'll tell you what, this is a funny suggestion, and I don't think anyone would ever take this suggestion up. But what I'm doing at the moment is I'm reading Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is absolutely massive. And it's a great pleasure to read because I just love his writing, Gibbon's writing. There was the famous quote was from Dr. Johnson: "Scribble, scribble, scribble, Mr. Gibbon." This strange little man who spent about 17 years writing this massive history of the decline of the Roman Empire. But it's just written beautifully. I've got a great love of the sort of, I guess, the kind of writing styles of these authors. I know it's non-fiction, of course, but it's the most entertaining, and I don't think it would appeal to everybody. But I just love his writing style, and I even he's full of little bon mots, little kind of observations, and of course he'll go in talking about one of the later 600 bloody emperors who got assassinated. Most of these emperors of ancient Rome lasted about 3 weeks, and then they were killed by the army. But he'll go off into well, of course, human nature is like this, as you will often. He'll have all these little observations. The other book I like purely for the writing style is Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, which I think there's some chapters in that I just admire the writing. I only reminded that before when you talked about people seeing sort of when you're interested in something, you sort of notice it everywhere because you have that kind of observation bias. There's a lovely line, it's actually a criticism somewhere in one of the chapters of Notre Dame de Paris, where someone says, he was like, he said, people who have but one idea see it everywhere. And talking about people who formulate the theories, lock everything into that theory there. And it's full of those sort of things. The other book, however, if you talk about influences, this one you'll find amusing. I'm an enormous admirer of Enid Blyton because I was that generation that grew up with her, and I think she's an absolute phenomenon. She is truly a genius, and the range of books that she wrote. She was always got very furious when people thought that she was like a factory and had other writers writing, but she turned out these books. But I was raised on the Noddy books, and I think the first Noddy book, which is one of the most brilliant things for kids ever written, because I don't know whether any of our participants tonight would know the Noddy books or how they begin, but the story of this little wooden man who's essentially like a doll who's been carved out of wood, we found wandering in the forest, and Big Ears the brownie takes him to Toyland because he thinks you belong in Toyland, and he has to learn how about clothes, he has to learn how about money, because he's a neonate, and they have to build him a house, and the neighbors help him. They give him old furniture and things like that. But then there's a question of whether he can get citizenship. He has to go before a court, and it's this extraordinary modern story about refugees. It's the whole story of refugees and immigrants coming in. He's got to go before the court and prove that he's worthy of being a citizen of Toy Town, and in the end, he's in trouble because he did do something wrong. But then he rescued a little doll from a toy lion, and so they decide he's worth being. So he has to pass a citizenship test, And I've never, for kids, it's an extraordinary book just about society. It's like, this is what you have to learn to survive in society. And in the next book, he gets a job, you know, and he gets jobs, and then he becomes a small businessman. It's an extraordinary, like for 6-7-year-olds.
And did you read the William books?
Into life.
Did you read the William books?
Yes, some of them. Yes, yes. And I can understand why you like those.
Yes.
And like character building.
They are character building, and he ends out on top.
Yes.
One of them.
Yes. They're optimistic, they're character building. And this was the wonderful thing about children's literature of that age, the 40s and 50s. The children are presented, the characters are presented with moral dilemmas. Sometimes they get it wrong, but then they get it right. And yeah, it's all about grace. It's guidance on growing up. It's introduction to the adult world.
When I was at Melbourne High School in 4th form, Arthur Cox, our English teacher, said, and how many books have you boys read? You know, and one boy read 1 and one boy read 2. I said I'd read 6. And he said, oh, that's just wonderful. What were they? And it was William Goes to School, William Has a Holiday. He didn't really think that was the sort of stuff I should be reading in 4th form.
Well, it was year 12 after all.
Yeah.
And that was.
Ross, I'm going to end on you because we're out of time. I want you to give me a number between 1 and 10, please.
7.
7, okay.
You haven't got one of those little paper things, have you?
It's my uber technically elevated approach to raffles, and because Ross, you chose 7. The winner of our raffle tonight is Nola Alexander. Congratulations, Nola.
So aren't we going to have any questions?
There were no questions, but I think we were a little bit in awe today, Ross and Ian, by the dynamic conversation between the two of you. But what I will do is, should there be questions that come in writing, I will forward them to you.
Sure.
In the meantime, Nola, can you send me your address and an email, and we will have your surprise to you. Thank you so much, Ian and Ross. May we see you again together elsewhere, and we look forward to the next adventures of Dr. Professor Grafton Everest.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
And thank you all.
Right. Good night, everybody. Good night.
Okay.